Thank you for joining us, and hopefully the other people in the lobby will also join, but the food is delicious. But thank you for joining us for our fourth and final inaugural season of the HMEI Faculty Seminar Series in Briger Hall. All of them went swimmingly up to now. And you know, we were warned not to try to do this when we first moved in, and we said we were going to forge ahead, and we showed we could do it. So fantastic. Thank you for joining. I had a long and very detailed sort of introduction, but because people are just rolling in at 12:19, I'm not going to do it. So instead, no, I'm kidding. I decided that most of you want to hear Carla speak. So as a brief introduction, Carla Staver is a professor in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. She joined us relatively recently this summer from Yale University, but it wasn't her first time here. Carla got her PhD in EB from Princeton University as well. So it is, hopefully we have landed here, and we're really excited because we see Carla's work as sort of instrumental to HMEI's strategy going forward, and so we're really, really excited to share a building with Carla. And with that, I'll let her take it over.
Okay. Thanks very much, Gabe. Thanks very much to HMEI, and thank you all very much for coming on this beautiful. It's the first wintry mix of the season, so thank you for coming. I'm going to be talking to you today about. I've given probably an overly ambitious title, as we all do, fire responses to climate variability and the implications for fire management. But I am going to try to rise to this goal that I set for myself. What you're looking at here is. Fire management team from the Working on Fire organization in South Africa, who's applying, they're really good at applying prescribed fires. Here they're doing it in the context of an experiment in Kruger National Park in South Africa, where we work a lot. And actually what is really amazing about what they're doing here is that they're applying a fire with no fire break. So they just went into an open field of grass and did a live fire break, and were able to do that safely in a way that it's a really tightly controlled fire. So I want to sort of be able to convince you by the end of this that that's a good idea, and that's something that's possible and that we should do more of. The reason you might think that that's not a good idea is that people really associate wildfires with natural disasters, and there are really good reasons for that. The fire that you're looking at on the left here, I believe is from Oregon, from a couple of years ago, sort of within the last decade, and you can see that that is a different fire. And there's fires that are hitting the news. I mean, at this point, it's multiple times a year. I find it's been a long year. It's almost over. The Palisades fire in California was this year. Can you believe that? It was like January of this year. The Lahaina fire was 2023. That's also mentioned there. Catastrophic wildfire. The Canadian wildfires this article is from this summer 2025. And there's Amazon basin wildfires that are a huge source of carbon emissions that are hitting the news every couple of years at this point. This is just a really small selection. There's wildfires in Greece. There were wildfires in Lebanon last year. There's huge wildfires in Portugal and Spain. So this is something that is increasingly making the news, and it would be perfectly natural to say, like, why do people think fires are natural disasters? Is because often fires are natural disasters. There's a really good reason for that. But because some wildfires are natural disasters, people sometimes assume that they all are. And in fact, most fires are not natural disasters. The fire that is pictured here is actually a fire that was accompanied a Reuters article about fires in the Amazon and carbon emissions from fires in the Amazon. Those of you, the four of you who are here from my lab will recognize that as very much not the Amazon. This is a Brazilian savanna known as Cerrado that is a fire-dependent ecosystem. It burns a lot. This is quite a friendly-ish sort of a fire in a savanna ecosystem. This is not a problem fire, but this accompanied an article about fires in the Amazon. And so people tend to, because some fires that we often really care about are natural disasters, people tend to tar all fires with that same brush. I referenced here the idea of a fire-dependent ecosystem. A lot of plants in regularly fire-prone ecosystems are adapted to and even depend on fire. So the examples that I have a couple of examples here for you. From the top left-hand corner, this cluster of plants are actually plants that depend on fire to reproduce. So the two in the top corner, this is actually sort of the same cone structure from a Banksia in Western Australia. This is before fire, and this is after fire, and you can see that the fire forces some mechanical changes in the structure of the cone, causing the cone to pop open and release its seeds into a burned post-fire environment where there are a lot of recruitment opportunities. The same thing has happened here in the case of this conifer cone. There's a really thick waxy cuticle on top of the cone that's really hard. It just doesn't break open until it is melted off in a fire. And again, this has now had the wax melted off, the seeds have popped out, and there's these opportunities for post-fire regeneration. This is an example here is again from Cerrado in Brazil. This is from some colleagues of ours who, unfortunately, my student Camila is in Texas learning how to use a pyrometer this week, but she is a co-author on this paper. This is a photo of post-fire flowering in a species of Cyperaceae. And these are flowers that come up within 24 hours of a fire happening, right? And so this is something where smoke and the experience of being burned is necessary for those plants to actually make flowers and then make seeds. So again, it's another way of taking advantage of that same post-fire environment, which is so vital. The cluster of photos on the right-hand side are photos of plants that are adapted to surviving fire. So these guys are reseeding or reproducing following fire, and these guys are persisting in the face of fire. And plants do this in a range of different ways. On the top here, you are looking at, I'm actually not sure what species of tree this is, but you can see that it has been burned. There's a lot of bark on this tree, and this tree has survived. It has survived absolutely no problem. We're in sort of central Mozambique here, and you can see that the plug of bark that was taken out of this tree is relatively thick, right? So it has a good amount of bark, and that tree has managed to survive that fire, despite being crisp. It's crisped. It's really been crisped. It's not been burned a little. It's been burned a lot. The photo here, I believe that Marie and I took these photos in the Appalachians. This is a photo of epicormic resprouting. So sometimes within that bark, what you get is buds that are buried and protected within the bark. And so sometimes when the tips of the plant die back and are consumed in a fire, the plant has to resprout from buds that can be held quite high up on the tree. So you can see that this is like aerial resprouting from the trunk. So it's epicormic resprouting. And then there are also plants that have adaptations like here, it has like a big old tuber and it stores starch in this tuber. And what you do with all that starch is you make new shoots, you make new above ground parts after the fire has passed through. This is an example of just such a sapling from the wild. You can see the root crown here where it's resprouted a bunch of times. You can see that there's a lot of root biomass here, and you can see that there's like a lot of resprouts here, but there's not a ton of above ground biomass. That's a sapling of Terminalia sericea, which would eventually turn into a mature tree that would have a lot of bark and be able to survive fires, but is surviving fires as a sapling by resprouting following repeated disturbances. So these are all examples of plants that have adaptations to surviving and perhaps even reproducing post-fires and may even depend on fire. I put in animals in parentheses there because that's not something that people have studied to nearly the same extent. There are animals living in ecosystems that are fire-prone. There are lots of them. So there must be things that animals do to survive these fires, but it's not as nearly as well studied a topic. So these fire-prone ecosystems are really interesting in that biodiversity is really fire-dependent. So what you're looking at here is a synthesis from Zach Gold, who's a student of Jonathan Levine's. Actually, he was an undergrad in my lab, which is how we come to be working together. And what he's done here is a synthesis of biodiversity responses to fire in fire experiments. So these are prescribed fire experiments where people have manipulated fire. And the data format is that we're looking at response sort of responses. So everything is standardized relative to an unburned control, which is why there's no data points. You can't compare an unburned control to itself. So anything above this dotted line represents an increase in biodiversity with burning. compared to the unburned control, and anything below it represents a decrease in biodiversity. And what you can, and then along the x-axis, we're looking at fire frequency. So anything from this is fires per year. So 1 fire per year would mean you're burning it every year. 1 fire per, or 0.2 fires per year means 1 fire every 5 years. And you can really see here at the top that woody species, so this would be trees and shrubs, experience a decrease in biodiversity in response to fire, whereas the ground layer, so the herbaceous layer, experiences an increase in biodiversity. Fire-prone ecosystems tend to have substantial ground layers, and so the ground layer response swamps the woody layer response to result in an overall net increase in biodiversity with fire management in fire-prone ecosystems. So this idea that biodiversity in fire-prone ecosystems is fire-dependent, it may seem intuitive, but it really is an important point that is sort of fairly recently being recognized in a comprehensive way. The next point that I want to make for you, so we started out, people really think about fires as being bad, but there's like a lot of, we really need fires in some places. The other main point that I want to make for you here as part of this setup is that I told you not all fires are bad fires. In fact, 80% of burned area on Earth occurs in grass-dominated ecosystems where fire is a natural part of the functioning of those ecosystems. And we know that the association between grass and fire is old. So this figure I took out of a published paper, but what I want to do is, and the grassland extent is shown here. The green is wet grasslands that we really think are probably more fire dependent. This is where I happen to be pointing right now is the Sahadbo, where that picture of post-fire flowering comes from. The brown ones are drier and probably a little bit less fire dependent, so they would be savannas whether they burned or not. But these are all grassland-dominated ecosystems, and what I'm going to switch over to showing you is that same map superimposed on a map of global burned area. And so you can really see that a lot of those, especially wet grasslands, mesic grasslands, are really strongly associated with a lot of annual burned area. Sometimes annual fire return intervals, right? They're burning every year. And these are places that are like really special, well-conserved, well-managed. They're well-conserved places. Like these are places where fire is not a natural disaster. I mentioned Sahadbo. This is like a good, intact, biodiverse Sahadbo ecosystem. This is a picture from Kruger National Park in South Africa. Burns a lot. This is Gorongosa in Mozambique. These are places this is a national park in Cambodia where I have a colleague working. This is Pench National Park in India. The Serengeti here. And actually, this is the Florida Panhandle. This is some Florida scrub in, I think it's Apalachicola National Forest. This is actually outside of a protected area, but in a very intact piece of savanna in the southern Congo. We also know that this association between grass and fire is very old. And so what you're looking at here is some earliest detection dates of grass. So what we're looking at, so the evidence of grass in the paleo record in this case is constituted of phytoliths. So like plants have these glass bodies and their silica bodies in their leaves that leave records. It's a little bit like pollen, except something else. Grasses make a lot of them. There's a lot of phytoliths in grasses, and they tend to be a little bit more distinctive than grass pollen. So all grass pollen looks kind of approximately the same, whereas different grasses make really distinct phytoliths. And so it's a good paleo proxy for grass occurrence. And you can see here that in this record in Southern Africa, grasses were detected 17 million years ago. That's just the first detection, first incidence. And we know that fire came to dominate this ecosystem 7 million years ago, right? So there's a lot of fire evidence before that. In Australia, actually, curiously, 7 million years ago, you get grass, and actually it's been burning for 34 million years. So there's been fire there for a long time. This is South Asia. 10 million years ago, we get grass, and approximately the same time you get an expansion of fire. So there, the argument is that fire expansion and grass expansion it's a really intimately tied process. And so this, again, we read about fires that are natural disasters, but in fact, most of the fires that are happening, and there are a lot of them happening every year, are happening in places where fire's a routine part of ecosystem functioning. And it's 80% of the burned area on Earth. Now, these these fires from grass-dominated ecosystems, so while fire in forests, for instance, the Amazon in the western US, are increasing in severity and extent and rate of spread, fires in grassy ecosystems are decreasing in extent and frequency. So what you're looking at on the top panel here is a really nice paper from a couple of years ago that is looking at the incidence of fires, so burned area, in the western United States through time. And you can see a clear increase in the incidence of fire through time. The observations that you really want to look at here are these red lines. They did some attribution work to show that if there had been no ACC here is anthropogenic climate change. So if there was no anthropogenic climate change in the system, you would not be seeing an increase in fire activity that was as large in scale. So they attribute the really large increases in burned area out west to the influence of climate change. I also show you this just to really demonstrate to you that fires in forests are increasing in extent. That's a robust observation. You can actually also see that in this graph on the bottom here, where you can see the burned area trend. So a positive trend corresponds to an increase. Fractional tree cover here, so 90% tree cover, these are forested ecosystems. So in forested ecosystems, burned area is tending to increase. But everything south of this or below this dotted line represents a decrease. So if you're really not in a closed canopy forest, the burned area trend actually is negative. And in these systems that I have told you are burning a ton, the burned area trend tends to be negative, right? And so we're losing burned area in those places. Now, I really don't want to, I have only good things to say about global climate models. And what I'm showing you here is the fire activity models associated with global climate models. I don't think I would be so glowingly positive about the fire models associated with them. They're just still in development. They're much more recent, and we're still trying to figure out how to do that well. What you're looking at here is, so the burned area trend, that sort of comes from the same paper that I just showed you. The burned area trend in observations is shown in this black line, and then the modeled burned area is from models is shown in the rest of these lines. So there's two things to notice here. First of all, this is now the trend and mean burned area from observations versus models. And the thing that you could see here is that models fail to capture the joint reality of high fire activity. So by and large, they don't capture the fact that there's a ton of fire activity all over the Earth system. And that fire activity is decreasing through time. So there's one or two models that get one of those things right, but they don't get both of those things right at the same time, or at least they didn't in 2017. These models either are statistical in nature or they are process-based models that are mostly based on processes that have been observed in forest ecosystems in the western United States. And so what you're trying to do is that you're trying to model the functioning of fire primarily in grassy ecosystems using process-based models that are not for grassy ecosystems. So the argument that I'm going to try to make for you today is that by not taking grass-fueled fires particularly seriously, we're making some flawed assumptions that hold back our understanding of fire in our system. And so I want to unpack a couple of ways that I think that that's the case and what I think that we could do better. All right. Claim number one, I want to say I went through like 4 iterations of what word to use here. I started with myth. I don't think they're myths. It's too strong. Oversimplification, assumption. I settled on claim. So claim number one is that drought conditions lead to increased fire activity. Being somebody who's sort of immersed in the study of this, I don't totally have a great intuition for whether this is something that people actually think. Who thinks this seems intuitive? I think this seems intuitive, right? Like you read that and you should sort of, I hope that a lot of you would be like, sure, that sounds right? Drought leads to increased fire activity. I'm not sure, but I think a lot of people think that this is true, and for good reason. I will say for good reason. But it is an oversimplification. And so what I'm showing you here is some results from an analysis from a graduate student in my group, Riley, who what she's doing here is analyzing observations of burned area against observations of climate variability, right? So what we're trying to say is if rainfall is higher or lower than average, what influence does that have on whether fire activity is higher or lower than average? And what you're seeing here, so the prediction that drought conditions leads to increased fire activity, would correspond to essentially we should see less and less fire as antecedent. This precipitation the year before increases, right? So if drought conditions, we should just see all of our fire activity should be happening at the dry part of this graph. And instead, what we are observing is that in really dry places, having less rainfall means less fire. And it's only when you're in fairly wet places. So we're sort of mostly talking tropics and subtropics here, so New Jersey is not a perfect analog, but the switch point here is about 1,200 millimeters of mean annual rainfall. That is wetter than we're sitting right here, right? Here in our wintry mix of a rainy to rainy day. This is drier than the switch point, right? So we're somewhere in the mix here where we could expect kind of a varied response. But drier systems than this should see an increase in fire activity in wet conditions. And so the reason that we think that that's the case, and that actually that's not super surprising, is that it's not enough for your fuel to be dry enough to burn. You also need something to burn, right? So the occurrence of fire depends on having fuel and also on that fuel being dry enough to burn. So in these wet places where productivity is really high, we tend to see like that fuel moisture limitation tends to be important, and you tend to see fires associated with dry conditions. But in dry places where productivity may not be as high, we tend to see fire instead associated with more productive years where more fuel has been produced. But you can also see coming out of this kind of an interesting dichotomy between, I've sort of emphasized for explaining this to you, I've emphasized these tropical grassy ecosystems that I've been talking to you about. We see it also applying to some extent in deserts. But curiously, tropical rainforests, so this would be like the Amazon or the Congo, you don't see that. Actually, what you actually see in tropical rainforests is that drought conditions lead to increased fire activity, like we would expect. Now, tropical rainforests probably don't occur that dry, but they stretch down, and we do get increases in fire activity associated with dry conditions. And the same thing is true in temperate mixed forests. The summary version of this is over here on the right-hand side. So anytime you get a switch from fuel amount to fuel moisture limitation or a hump-shaped response to rainfall, you get we're in these green cases, and then these blue ones down at the bottom here are cases where the response is drought means more fire all the time, right? And so you can really see that there's a lot of ecosystems where we're seeing this switch, but there's also a lot of ecosystems where we are not, right? Okay, what organizes that? A really important organizing process. Actually, what we have here is grass relative abundance on the x-axis. Probably tree relative abundance is a better thing to put on the x-axis here. But this roughly makes the case, is that it's really those grass-dominated ecosystems, or ecosystems are not dominated by trees, that switch from fuel amount to fuel moisture limitation. And the ones that are really, where fire is really associated with drought, tend to be tree-dominated ecosystems. There's a really basic reason that this might be the case. You all presumably have made a fire in your life, okay? And probably what you did to make a fire in your life is that you balled up some newspaper, and you that's really easy to catch on fire. And eventually you would throw some kindling on, and you would throw some fire on, some wood on, and then you would sort of sustain a fire for a long time with the wood that you threw on. Grass is a little bit like paper, okay? If it's wet, it dries pretty fast, and you can burn it really easily. Trees are like wood, and they're good at carrying fires, but they have to be really dry. So if you cut down a fresh tree and you try to light it on fire, you will not have any success with that. And you have to allow that wood to cure for a very long time, and if it is re-wet, it's going to take it a while to dry out. So what we think is going on here is that fuel moisture limitation is more important in woody types of fuels that are much more resistant to drying than grasses are. Grasses cure in the space of a month or two. A short dry season is sufficient to allow grasses to cure and carry a fire. And actually, they dry out really easily after they're re-wet if they were dry already. And so that fuel moisture limitation probably is much more important in woody fuels than it is in grassy fuels. And I don't really want to belabor this point, but I do want to say that the fire models don't capture this very well. And the Spitfire models, or the ones that are these process-based models, seem to do the worst. And so we don't differentiate between grassy and woody fuels particularly effectively in global models, and that's something that we could probably do better. It would not be very hard to do that better. Okay. Next thing I want to say, you might be thinking, okay, fine, but like we're burning a lot and a lot of that's anthropogenic and whatever. Actually, this is not a recent phenomenon. So what you're looking at here is some paleoecological data from across the African continent. So we're stepping down in the examples that I'm going to show you here from lake in a very dry place. So this is the Turkana Basin in northern Kenya. Then we are stepping to a slightly wetter place, to Lake Tanganyika, and then we're in the wettest place here is Lake Bosumtwe in Ghana. In the driest place, and what you need to see for all of these graphs is that we're really zooming in on a wetting event from, this looks like it's 14,000 to 6,000 years ago. This is the African humid period. And the African humid period occurred in all of these lakes, and you can see the traces of the African humid period in these delta D records that reflect potentially hydrological processes, right? So the African humid period was wetter than the time before and the time after. And what do we see in terms of fire activity in all of these lakes? First of all, in the driest lake, when it gets wetter, there's a lot more fire activity, and then when it gets drier again, there's a lot less fire activity. At the next lake up, what we see is that as it gets wetter, we get first an increase in fire activity and then a decrease in fire activity, and then fire activity stays down. It actually doesn't come back again. And then at the wettest lake, you actually see a fairly precipitous decline in fire activity associated with African humid period. Again, which we think is really reflecting that sort of difference between fuel amount versus fuel moisture limitation in these different systems. The question of why this fire activity doesn't increase again with drying is a really interesting one. I have been to Lake Bosumtwe, and it is a forested ecosystem. And so the thinking is that at the beginning of the African humid period, it didn't burn, it transitioned into a forest. And then once it was a forest, it stayed a forest. And so the reason fire activity stayed low is because it's not enough to know about what climate is like to know about fire activity. You also have to think about feedbacks with vegetation. So this represents kind of an interesting example of potential hysteresis in ecosystem structure and feedbacks with fire. All right. The next claim that I want to talk you through is this idea, the idea that is out there that if we could just prevent fires, the carbon emitted in those fires would be stored. So one of the negative implications to fire activity is that fire volatilizes carbon, okay? And so like we want less carbon in the atmosphere, so it wouldn't be great if we could just stop fire from doing that. So goes the idea. And like the first claim, it makes a lot of sense in some really important ways, okay? So the news articles that I'm giving you on top reflect public concern over really scientifically robust findings. So record-breaking 2024 Amazon fires drive unprecedented carbon emissions and ecosystem degradation. The example below that comes from Indonesian fires in 2015 that burned a lot of peat in Indonesian forests. How Indonesia's fires became one of the world's biggest climate disasters. The banner result there is that a bunch of peat burned, and the largest source of anthropogenic carbon emissions that year was from peat fires in Indonesia in 2015. That is it's a real bad thing, right? Now, what happens when you transpose that idea to these savanna ecosystems that I've been telling you about? Well, people have tried to do that. There was, I don't know if you remember this, I really do. It was 2019, and somebody made some comments about how the Amazon burning was bad, and then somebody else got mad about how, well, I think it was Bolsonaro, was like, yeah, there's more fires in Africa. And then, Macron decided that they have to stop the fires in Africa too, and then it turned into this whole thing, right? And you can see here, I don't know if you remember the fire activity map, but here's your fires. This is probably Southern Hemisphere dry season, but so the fires are really located in the Southern Hemisphere. This is seasonal map. But, there's all these fires in Southern Africa, and they are grassy ecosystem associated fires. The forest is not burning in Africa, okay? The grassland is burning. And that's all a little bit of it turned into like a kerfuffle is the thing. Maybe you remember, maybe you don't. Anyways. But it's also something that has leaked into sort of more people very credibly think about this. And they think about the fire emissions from fires in Southern Africa, fires in grassy ecosystems globally, and how much carbon we might be able to store if we could stop. What are the emissions fluxes associated with the fires that are occurring in savanna ecosystems, and what if we could just hold on to them? So this one's a little bit trickier, but I think it's worth diving into, and I want to try to convince you of this. So by and large, this is a picture of a savanna fire from Kruger. They have some experimental burn plots. This is what a savanna fire looks like. And what I want you to see here is that it's really spreading primarily through the grass layer. And what is being volatilized as the fire moves through here is the grass, and then maybe some very, very small tree saplings. But hopefully what you can see is that this ecosystem is full of trees that are not susceptible to fire, okay? So what's being volatilized in savanna fires is not tree carbon. It's this small pool of grass carbon that exists in this ecosystem, okay? First of all, it's a small component of that ecosystem, but second of all, what's really, it doesn't matter. Even if it was small, the emissions are large in total, maybe it matters, maybe, maybe you can make a case for that. The problem is that this grass grows back really fast, okay? So there's a huge flux out of this ecosystem, but then the grass grows back and there's a huge flux back into this ecosystem. You can see here, so this is the difference between an annual fire regime and a triannual fire regime. There are gains here in carbon with fire suppression, but the gains are slow. They've accumulated here over repeated burning for 75 years, and they arise from the demographic effects of not burning saplings and not from preventing those annual fluxes from occurring or those triennial fluxes from occurring, right? Those gains do not equate to the integral of annual fire-driven emissions by any means. They're not the same process. They're not the same, they're not even a fraction of what's emitted with the grass volatilization. It's just a different process and a different set of mechanisms that gives you carbon changes long-term in response to fire. Because the grass grows back so quickly. Why is that carbon not lost? It's because grass grows back super fast from fire. I don't think this is a great graphic for this. It's actually hard to find a really good one. What you're looking at here is time since fire in observations of savanna ecosystems in Kruger, grass biomass on the y-axis, and you can see that there's like a saturating response of grass biomass accumulation to time since fire. And standing grass biomass mostly recovers within about 2 to 5 years of fire. So because grass grows back quickly, standing biomass saturates, and if fire doesn't consume grass biomass, something else will, or it will decompose, right? So this is a really fast turnover carbon pool. And so what fire is doing is incrementally speeding the turnover of an already very fast turnover carbon pool. It is not volatilizing carbon that has been there or will be there for a very long time. This is what that grass regrowing looks like. So this is a savanna that has been burned. It's actually, again, in the experimental burn plots. This had burned maybe 2 weeks before the fire. And so this is how much grass has already regrown within 2 weeks. And actually, the reason I think this is a fun picture is that you can see, if it's high resolution enough, that there's some little squared off grass tips here. And that is some zebras that have been eating this regrowing grass. That's really nutritious. And so a lot of animals actually rely on burned patches for nutrition, really nutritious green grass. So to put an even sort of blunter point on this, savanna fires represent a really large flux out of savanna ecosystems, but they are balanced by an equivalent substantial flux into savanna ecosystems. And so the grass pool turns over really quickly, and while the numbers may sound big when you add them up over large areas, they're actually really not important for long-term carbon storage. Like the analogy that I would give you for those of you who are not necessarily ecosystem people is, if I tell you that I'm spending a lot of money every month, do you know that I'm poor? Or do you need more information? You need more information, right? If I'm spending a lot of money every month, I may be making a lot of money every month, and therefore my bank account is fine. Or I may have started out rich, and I'm not making a ton of money, but I had a ton of money, and so I still have a ton of money I still have money in my bank account. The flux out is not sufficient information. It only means anything in the context of the other information, of the system, of other information about how that ecosystem cycles carbon, right? And that's what's going on here, is this large flux out, but also this large flux into the ecosystem. The other thing that I want to point out to you here is that this is qualitatively different from the fires that I introduced at the beginning about from the Amazon and from Indonesian peat fires, where fires in those ecosystems are volatilizing carbon that has been stored for a long time and that could be stored for an additional very long time if we didn't burn it, right? So it's worth the energy stopping fires from happening in the Amazon, because the carbon that you would not emit by stopping those fires has a long residence time in that ecosystem. Same with peat ecosystems, peat forest ecosystems. And to give this to you again in visual terms, you've already seen this picture. This is from Kruger. This is a picture from a fire experiment in the southern Amazon that is managed here by, here they are, Palo Brando in pink in the middle and Divino Silvedo on the right-hand side there in blue. This was a forest that was burned actually in very mild fires over the course of 7 years. I think it was burned twice in 7 years. And you can see that the fire killed all the trees and that the recovery has not been anything to near complete, right? And so these are ecosystems that have not recovered the carbon that were stored in them, and where all that carbon, there was a huge amount of carbon that was potentially volatilized in those fires. So these are not the same. These are just not the same, and they should not be treated as having the same impact on the global carbon cycle. Okay, great. How much, what am I supposed to, am I wrapping up here? Oh, and you can actually also see some of the fire susceptibility here. So this is a bark sample from an Amazon forest tree, and you can see that it's a very thin bark sample, and here's that same bark sample that I showed you from before, so you can really see that fire tolerance in action. Okay, this last one is quick. So a related reality is that fires are difficult to prevent, right? So sometimes what happens when you try not to burn something is that you make it a lot worse later. So fire suppression and tree planting have real contributions to extreme fire behavior. You can see here in this example on the right-hand side are some forests out west. This is from the US, this is a graphic from the USDA, Pacific Northwest Research Station. There's a forest here that was not treated with prescribed fire versus the forest that was, and then an extreme fire came through, and you can really see the difference in what prescribed fire does, so managed fire can do and help preparing that ecosystem for fire. And some of that, I sort of referred at one point to extreme wildfires in Portugal. Some of the worst wildfires that ever happened in Portugal happened in tree plantations and burned people's homes and had a lot of economic impacts once they jumped out of those plantation forest systems. But having too many trees and too much fuel to burn in places that are dry enough to burn frequently can be a real problem. You know about Smokey Bear. All right. And so I'm sort of wrapping up here. I hope I've convinced you of the importance and the necessity and the sort of lack of problematic aspect of fire management as something that we should do. Fire could be increasingly difficult to manage under climate change, and that is as extreme fires become more and more prevalent. I don't have much to tell you about this because this is research that we're sort of hotly in progress in my lab, but I could tell you a little bit here. What you're looking at on the left-hand side is some projections across the continental United States that people have made. They're predicting how fire is expected, or how conditions for managed fire are expected to change in response to climate change. On the top here, we have the change in burn days. So you can either have an increase or a decrease in burn days. And you can see that over a lot of the continental United States, we are losing opportunities for prescribed fire. On the bottom, what we see here is changes in the number of days where FDIs, or fire danger indices, exceed the 95th percentile. And so you can see that actually the vast majority of the continental United States is seeing fire danger indices that are going up, right? They're just drought conditions for fire to occur are just getting really bad. And that, hopefully, you are convinced by now that misses a lot of the nuances of fire behavior and a lot of what we think about as prescribed fire managers think about for fire behavior. So this is work that's being led by, sorry Marie that you're really on screen forever here, Marie Norwood. Before she came to do a PhD, did some fire management work, and you can see her there with a drip torch and a lot of safety gear on. Drip torch is what you use to ignite a prescribed fire. She has a lot of trainings associated with how to do that safely in a manner that doesn't escape. So I think she's good at that. But the data that you're looking for here, it comes from Archibald Biological Station, which is sort of in the central Florida region here. in the Lake Wales Ridge. And what I really like about this graphic is that you can see, so what we're looking at here on the y-axis is relative humidity. You may know that Florida is a wet place. We are really dealing with fuel moisture being a problem in Florida ecosystems. So there's a lot of times of the year where it's pretty wet. These are daily observations of relative humidity over time. So it's wet a lot of the time. It's too wet for them to burn a lot of the time. It's also sometimes too dry for them to burn because fire would be unsafe under extremely dry conditions, right? And then there's some really nice sort of Goldilocks days in the middle where it's both dry enough but not too dry to burn safely. And it's really these Goldilocks conditions that you're looking for when you try to apply prescribed fires. What you can see here over time is that we're losing some of those Goldilocks conditions, actually in Central Florida because it's getting wetter, right? So there's still plenty of days where dangerous fires could happen, but the opportunities for prescribed fires are going down because most days are getting wetter. And so this is a kind of a dangerous mixture where you aren't able to do prescribed fires that could be preventive for extreme fires, but you still have the potential for extreme fires happening in that ecosystem. And that's a really bad combination. I don't know if this was probably early days to be showing this to people, Marie, but this is in the works and it's coming. I want to sum up. So fully incorporating these nuances about fire behavior and impacts offers a path forward for improving fire prediction and improving the way that we manage fires. Reality number one, both wetting and drying can lead to more fire activity, and the combination is probably worse, right? Wetting, where you produce a lot of fuel, followed by drying, where you make it really flammable, is a bad combination. And the combination of wetting and drying is something that's happening in a lot of places. Reality number two is that the impacts of fire on the carbon cycle depend on context. Fire emissions have a larger impact on slow turnover carbon in fire-sensitive ecosystems. And finally, proactive fire management is an indispensable tool for confronting a future with more extreme fire potential. Okay, I want to thank a couple of people. I talked to you about Riley's work. Riley's up there. It's a great picture. And then I showed you work from Tyler Karp and Young Zhou, who are both postdocs in my group and have gone on to faculty positions. I was looking on the internet for this picture, which is an Andy Warhol picture of Superman blowing on a fire to put it out, and I don't know if that's how it works, Superman. But meanwhile, I found that there have been two superheroes called Wildfire. This is the older one from 1941, and this one's from 1973. And I was really surprised that Wildfire was a good guy, sort of somewhat ambiguous, shades of gray good guy, but kind of a good guy in both iterations of Wildfire as a superhero. But anyways, thank you very much for your attention.
All right, folks, we are now going to enter the Q&A part of the afternoon. And so I have, for those of you on Zoom, I have a laptop here that will pop up the questions if you type them into the prompt. For those of you here in real life, we have a couple of mics that we can get to you. And as Carla calms down from that great talk, what I would ask is that the first question maybe could come from a student or an early career scholar, if they feel up to it. And we have a question there in blue. That's blue? Maybe it's teal or maybe it's green.
Looks blue to me.
It's blue, okay.
Thank you for the great seminars, and I have one question about the observation or detection of the fires. As I know that it's like the Boreal forest fires near the Chinas are much more controlled by the human activities, and the fires near the Russian boundaries are much more like the natural things. So I think that this kind of detecting and human management of the fire would be really important for finding some relationship between this climate variability and fire things. So how do you think about this possibility or interpretation of this human management to the fire?
That's a great question. And it's true that it's something that I sort of avoided entirely speaking about. I think that a lot of times when people think about humans and fire management, they could think about a couple of things. One is that they really associate humans with fire ignitions, right? And so that's what sort of the Smokey Bear example is it's really an ignitions focused thing, right? Only you can make sure that you are burning your campfire in a safe way that is not resulting to an ignition. And so I think ignitions have dominated a lot of the way that we have thought about anthropogenic fires for decades. And I think another thing that you might think about, and I understand to be fairly relevant in the Chinese case, is that there's active fire suppression, right? So if you're more proximal to like LA, you're going to pour a huge amount of effort into putting a fire out and into controlling a fire that is a wildfire. And the net effect of that is that fires that happen near human settlements tend to be smaller. But I think that the other thing that can be a huge influence on, the other thing that can be a huge influence, and which I believe to be somewhat neglected in all of this, is that humans can also have passive fire suppression effects. And so one of the things that, like, fires are smaller near human settlements, not just because we put more effort into putting them out there, but because we introduce fire breaks into the ecosystem that make fires smaller inherently, right? And so a road for a relatively small fire can act as a very effective fire break that prevents fires from getting larger. And so as landscapes become more fragmented in the human context, you tend to see fires associated with that, even in places that are not particularly known for investing in fire suppression. But then to round out the answer, what you tend to see is a burned area that peaks kind of at intermediate human population densities. And so that people do have this tendency to, there's actually a number of fires that peaks at intermediate human population density. The fires are really big at low human population density, but you don't have as many human ignitions. Fires are very small where there's many people and you have a lot of ignitions, but they're so small that it actually doesn't add up to very much. And then I think it is burned area. It's at intermediate human population densities where fires have some opportunity to grow, but where there are enough ignitions in the landscape to really increase burned area. So I think is the roundabout way that I would answer to your question, is that intermediate population densities are really where people have the biggest effect of increasing burned area.
Okay, so
Thank you.
We're going to take more questions. I see. In the meantime, before I see Wen Chang in there, but first we have a related question to this recent one online, which is the asker asks, they met PG&E in California and learned that the biggest cause of wildfires is overhead wires going through forests, suggesting that cable undergrounding becomes vital. But in many Princeton neighborhoods, we have precarious overhead wires. Is there any comment on that? I think this relates to the...
Yeah, sure. I mean, the sparks, I'm not an electrical wiring expert by any means, but in general, there's a lot of biomass kicking around the Princeton ecosystem, but it's generally speaking not wet enough to burn, or it's too wet to burn. So you just wouldn't worry about overhead wiring in a place like this where the vegetation you're gonna struggle to get that to catch fire, right? So I wouldn't worry about that in Princeton unless there was like a multi-year drought and all the trees got crispy and you're not allowed to water your lawns. And I mean, everything, you really need a lot of dead, dry vegetation it's got to be a tinderbox for the overhead wiring to make a difference. The reason Princeton is different from California is that California is dominated by what we call a Mediterranean. It's a Mediterranean type climate. I guess the Mediterranean got there first in terms of naming rights. But it's a wet winter, and so it can be fairly productive in the wet winter, produces a lot of biomass, and then the hottest months of the year tend to be very dry. And so California is hot and dry, and we all know that, right? California is hot and dry in the summer. It's sort of wet and cold in the winter. All things these being relative descriptors. And it's the hot, dry summers that can lead to fuel really drying out in those summer months. But also the sequence of several hot, dry summers not interspersed with as wet winters that lead to accumulated drying. So it has to be like the fuel conditions have to be there for the sparks from the overhead wires to be in effect. So it's not to say like but to connect this to my answer to the previous question, it's really an ignition-focused solution to that problem, right? So the solution says if we could just not light the vegetation when it is at its most flammable, that is how we should be doing this. And an alternative, or let's just say a complementary perspective, because it really is not an alternative. You can do all these things at once, is that fuel management and some prescribed fire management in places that are going to burn eventually is probably a part of a solution towards reducing extreme wildfire. So the Pacific the Palisades fire in particular was because it had spread through a fairly urban park, is something that people hadn't wanted to burn prescribed fires in because people complain about smoke from prescribed fires and so on. So there are parts of that reserve that hadn't burned in decades. And so there was just a lot of stuff there to burn. And so that is a place where, that and the California contracts in general is a place where some judicious use of prescribed fire might have some contribution to reducing standing fuel loads and therefore to reducing extreme fire behavior.
So Wen-Cheng and then Allison.
Which is not to discount from the effects of anthropogenic climate change, which are also really important.
Yeah, hi, Carla. Very nice talk. And looking at the relationship between the fire and the dry conditions, I'm curious what metrics of drought are usually used in fire study, like precipitation or relative humidity, specific humidity, or even like a vapor pressure deficit. Do you have any comments on that?
That's a great question, and I really want to make Marie answer, but it's fine. I will try. It depends. It sort of depends on where you are. Actually, American fire practitioners love something called the Keach-Byram Drought Index (KBDI), which integrates a lot of those things into one metric that you can calculate. But it is an accumulated. It's an accumulated metric. So but to unpack that, there's a couple of things so the weather on the day of can matter. So relative humidity would be the day of the fire. Vapor pressure deficit would be the day of the fire, and those are both things that people have used to describe the conditions on the day of the fire, and that come out, I believe, as being important in your Archbold analysis and come out repeatedly as being important in analyses of fire activity. The other thing that can be important, a lot of, the things that determine fuel moisture are accumulated drought metrics. And so KBDI is a drought metric that accumulates, if it's been dry for months and the vegetation is dry, then that really hugely increases the probability of having a fire. And how you want to, there's another one called Palmer drought severity that people sometimes use. And there's any of these sort of integrative, like time integrative drought metrics can provide a description for fuel moisture. But the most direct measure of fuel moisture is fuel moisture, which is just percent, what percent of the dry weight of the fuel is water, right? So you put some grass in the oven, you dry it, and it loses half its weight. It has 100% fuel moisture. And that is the one that in savannas people use the most often. But that really depends on being able to go out and collect information about fuel moisture beforehand, so it's quite a derived thing from what you can observe in terms of the weather.
Allison, Stefan, and I think Danny.
Thank you, Carla. So I lived in Altadena for 5 years, so that was where the Eaton Fire. So I have an ecological question. So you talked us through the kind of grassland forested dynamics here really persuasively. So the Eaton Fire starts in a canyon that's scrub, comes out into a community where there's a lot of pine trees planted throughout Altadena. The Palisades Fire is steep coastal chaparral that abuts forested areas. So these are actually different ecosystems that in the same amount of time have explosive fires at the so-called urban wildland interface, 9,000 structures in Altadena gone. Where do they sit in kind of your ecological spectrum here? And what would a different kind of fire management strategy look like in the LA Basin, given you have so many different ecosystems and microclimates that stretch across that populated region?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think that there were some cases there's some really good cases from a variety of places. There were some, I don't know if, are your pines native or non-native?
I don't know the answer to that question for Altadena.
Okay. Yeah. I lived in Cape Town for several years, and they have planted pine forest that actually people are really, really attached to, really fond of. And several years ago, a fire spread through. I mean, there's so much biomass in it that it is very prone to fire, and those are for sure non-native pine trees nested within a native ecosystem that is a fire prone. It's sort of a chaparral equivalent. It's called fynbos in the Cape region of South Africa. And so I don't actually know if that fire started in the pine forest or if it started in the fynbos, but either way, it's perfectly able to spread through both vegetation types. Wound up burning some buildings at University of Cape Town, including a sort of old manuscript library at University of Cape Town, resulting in the loss of some really irreplaceable stuff. It was a real tragedy. And it was a real controversy at the time because that that pine forest is really important for recreation. People love the shade. They love running in there. They love walking in there. But it's an ecosystem that probably doesn't have much place in a place that is as fire prone as that is, right? So sort of like it was a tragedy waiting to happen in some sense, right? But my understanding of the Palisades fire, not being a California expert in any way, shape, or form, is that there was a lot of there's like sparks, like there were palm trees that had been introduced that were burning, that were propagating sparks into residential neighborhoods that they wouldn't have gotten to if they hadn't been planting vegetation that really had no place being there, right? And so I think it can be things like managing ignitions from overhead power lines, but it is also fuels management, and it doesn't have to be fuels management in like a narrow sense, right? It doesn't have to be fuels treatments. It can be fuels treatments, but it doesn't have to be. But I think the other reality is that we've sort of somewhat offline have conversations with people like fire ecologist colleagues who, you have a conversation about how often you would have to prescribe fire in the California context in order to reduce fuels enough to really make a difference. And, a super back of the envelope answer that I won't give a name to, I don't want to tell you who said this because I don't want them to be held responsible for it. I don't know if it's true, but would be that you have to burn it about as often as you have to burn a savanna, which is once every 3 to 5 years. So do you want to do prescribed fire every 1 to 5 years, 3 to 5 years across the entire state of California? What would you do? You'd have less extreme fire, but it would also represent a huge ecological impact. It would represent people having to get really tolerant of a lot of smoke pollution during prescribed fires in a way that they are currently not. It would represent a huge investment of effort in a way that they are currently not. So it's like possible to do fuels management in a way that reduces the extreme fire risk. It just requires way, 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 way more effort than we're currently doing. My understanding, I just was reading an article that CAL FIRE has started doing fuels treatments to do fire breaks. It can also, where I'm going with this is it can have unintended consequences. And so they're going in with bulldozers, trying to bulldoze chaparral to try to create fire breaks, and then what happens is that the invasive grasses, which are super flammable, colonize the disturbed areas really quickly, and then you have grass-fueled, potentially annual fire regimes that come in associated with these invasive grasses. So I don't think it's a really easy answer. I also don't think you can get away from the fact that climate change is causing fires to just happen more frequently and to be more extreme in that ecosystem. And so fuels management is useful and important, but it's not like an easy solution in that ecosystem, right?
Stefan, you had a question?
My question would be regarding the carbon storage. Thank you. My question would be regarding the carbon storage that you mentioned. After the fires accelerate the decay, basically, of, say, dead carbon. What do you think globally is the net effect of having fires versus a world without fires? Is the carbon storage over land affected, say, by 1 per mil or 1% or 10%, or is it not even measurable?
I actually, curiously, so a fire burns a bunch of grass and you get a lot of the carbon in the grass is volatilized. Some of it is left behind and is often referred to as pyrogenic carbon. So a lot of the charcoal that's there is actually really resistant to decomposition. So it speeds re-emission of some fraction of the carbon pool, but it potentially really slows re-emission of what is left. And I saw some recent estimates from a colleague, really unpublished estimates of the pyrogenic carbon fraction in some of these frequently burned savannas, and it's something like 20% of the carbon in soils is pyrogenically derived, right? So it's fire-derived carbon. And it is a pretty slow turnover carbon pool. What do I think the net effect of having fires on terrestrial carbon storage is? That feels like a trick question. No, it feels like a trick question because, if you could shut down fires, you would have more carbon stored in the terrestrial biosphere. And that's important to be honest about that, right? The process is not the annual, it's not, you can't count up the annual flux that you get from savanna fires and say that this corresponds, we're just gonna save that, right? So the point that I'm trying to make is that you're not gonna get the additional carbon storage that you're gonna get from preventing the annual flux. It actually accumulates much more slowly via much more slow processes, right? So you can't just add up the grass biomass that gets volatilized and get the answer that way. It's a much slower process. You get in Kruger with fire suppression for 75 years, you get on average, it's 0.35 and I'm not going to remember the units, megagrams of carbon per hectare. Would that be a reasonable unit? We could look it up. Sorry, I don't remember what units that's supposed to be in. So it just is a fairly slow process. But I think what you miss in that is that the answer the answer to Allison's question and some of the other questions before is that you would have a lot of carbon. It's if you could extinguish fires in the Earth system. The reality is that you cannot, right? And so a lot of what is, it's not just a question of how can you maximize how much carbon you're storing in the terrestrial biosphere, but also a question of how, we have other human goods that we're trying to maximize alongside carbon in the biosphere, and human safety is one of them. Right? And so a terrestrial biosphere that had as much carbon as it could hold would be more flammable than the terrestrial biosphere that we have today. Right? So anyways, I didn't give you a number, but that's because I'm not able to give you a number, but it would have more. I think what you're getting at is would it have more? And the answer is yes.
So Danny had a question, and I've been looking that direction. But I think it'd have to be the last question from time.
Okay, so one of the disagreements between data and models that really bugs me is that most of the predictions for aridity under global warming is that it will increase on land. And on the other hand, when we look over the Cenozoic, the last 60 million years or so, there's been cooling. And over that time period, grasslands took over from forests, most people feel like in most large areas. And that has always seemed, the interpretation has been that change from woodlands to grasslands was associated with increased aridity under cooling. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering whether there's a role for fire in this to help explain that apparent disagreement. That is to say, you see that issue?
Yeah, we're in the middle of trying to put together those 3 records that I showed you for fire activity going back to not quite the LGM. I wanted to be able to show you, and we couldn't quite get it together, some synthesis curves. So we have been going through a process of trying to digitize and really put together there are out there, you can find synthesis curves for global fire activity through the paleo record, and they tend to be focused on North American and European lakes because that's where most of our fire records come from. And so African ecosystems, where the majority of burned area is, are also the least represented in the paleo record, and therefore the net effect is that our understanding of paleo fire activity is super incomplete. Our response was to try to digitize what's available and see if we can do a little bit better, and then come up with some weighting schemes to make the African records worth more in their contributions to a global curve. But the African synthesis curve that we have come up with so far provisionally does have LGM, actually the overall in Africa, there's a lot of uncertainty going back to LGM because a lot of the records don't go that far back, but there is more burning associated probably with grassland expansion in the LGM, probably. But we have really low confidence in that. I think that's also the case in South America as well, is that there was more grass expanded during this cool, arid time during the LGM. And so grassland expansion associated with fire expansion probably is something that played a role there. I'm not sure how it helps resolve the model data comparison that you've identified, because I don't totally think I understand how that works. But I mean, there are dynamics in fire that respond to these processes that you're referring to. So it for sure could have feedbacks.
A little bit. It depends on whether the fire comes before the grasslands or the grasslands before the fire. But
oh, sure. Probably too fast. Whichever one comes first, it comes first by much less time than we would be able to resolve from a paleo record, unfortunately, if that makes sense.
Okay, so with that, I'd like to thank Carla again. It's a great. And before you get up, this is the last HMEI Faculty Seminar for this semester, but next semester, we have a whole slate lined up. In February, Professor Chris Ramsey from Politics and Professor of World Politics of Peace and War will be our faculty presenter. In March, it'll be Professor Andre Graham from EEB and the co-director of the Program of Global Health Immunities and Disease Ecology. In April, it'll be Professor Ian Borg from the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering and HMEI. In May, it'll be Professor Sarah Grossman, who's a Barron visiting professor of environmental humanities, who's visiting from Bryn Mawr. And then in March 17th, so you can put that down, we will have our spring Taplin lecture. Professor Catherine Hayhoe, who's the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy and is a professor of political science at Texas Tech, will be giving our Taplin lecture. So we will have a full series next semester, so please come and join us again. And thank you for coming.